Hello, I'm Stefan Kubiak, and I teach academic writing at the University of Białystok. Among my interests are mutual impacts culture make one on another. It is so obvious that speaking of any pure culture is a nonsense. At the moment, it goes without saying that due to the media, television, film production, and the internet, we all remain under a strong influence of the culture or cultures of English-speaking countries. However, there were periods of history when people speaking English drew heavily from other cultures. It is no secret that throughout the Middle Ages it was Latin and the tradition of the Roman Empire that dominated among the civilizational endeavors of educated people in Western Europe. Since the heart of the ancient Rome was Italy, it is obvious that Rome and Italy was still an attractive point of reference for those who pretended to be cultivated, cultured, and well educated. Since those who could afford such pretenses were mostly aristocrats, it was they who set off on trips to the cradle of Latin culture, which is Italy. If you enter Grand Tour in the search engine, for example Google, you certainly find information about trips taken by English aristocrats, usually the oldest sons of the richest families, as well as few ladies, which however was not so common, to Europe, mainly France and Italy, even though there were tourists who visited also Germany, Switzerland, and those most curious, even Poland. The beginning of those trips is usually dated as the 17th century. The purpose of such a long sojourn from 2 to 4 years abroad was to make a genuine gentleman. The formative process could embrace skills typical of upper classes such as interlocution or the art of conversation, good manners, dance, horse riding, and fencing. It is worth bearing in mind that Italy from the Middle Ages through the 18th century was famous for its masters of European martial arts or the art of fighting. Those of more intellectual inclinations could immerse themselves in books, listen to the most popular operas and symphonic orchestras, as well as admire galleries full of paintings of the first-class masters, actually the best in the world. The authors of encyclopedic entries will usually inform us that the French Revolution put an end to the English expeditions to the continent, including Italy, making the trip too dangerous. Thus, we may have an impression that the era of grand tours lasted around 200 years, if not 150. If we take into account the length of the Englishmen's stays in Italy, we could more or less agree with this conclusion. However, it doesn't mean that they didn't travel to Italy before that period. Moreover, the evidence is also abundant enough to demonstrate that Italy did not cease to be a popular destination of educated English people. I'd like to invite you to a short trip over history during which we have a look at a certain travelers or tourists, since it is worth remembering that the Grand Tour contributed to the origins of this popular term. Fascination with Italy in England was much earlier than the 17th century. Because of lack of time, we aren't going to go back to the Old English or Anglo-Saxon period, but let me start with the father of English literature, as some love to call him, the author writing in the language called today Middle English, Geoffrey Chaucer. If you ask an English student to name Chaucer's most famous text, they would certainly say the Canterbury Tales. But is the very idea of people meeting in an inn on the way to Canterbury, the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, an original idea? The settings are English, of course. The pilgrimage destination is also English, but what about the random people from all possible walks of life telling stories? Certainly, Chaucer could have come up with the idea himself, but it is tempting that he was inspired by Decameron, the book written in 1349 by the Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio. We didn't know whether Chaucer met Boccaccio in person. Theoretically, it was possible because his first visit to Italy, Genoa to be precise, took place 2 years before the author of Decameron died. And when Chaucer arrived in Italy for the second time in 1378, Boccaccio had been dead for 2 years, and it seems impossible, however, that a man of letters such as Geoffrey Chaucer did not read his Decameron during his trip to Italy. For Geoffrey Chaucer spent 115 days as a member of English embassy to courts of Italian rulers. By the way, Italy is a relatively new country, for before 1861 the peninsula was a mosaic of independent kingdoms, principalities and republics. Thus, Chaucer participated in a diplomatic mission to Milan, where he visited the court of Bernabo Visconti, and probably traveled also to Pavia, ruled by Bernabo's brother, Galeazzo Visconti. The latter is known for being a sponsor of Petrarch, the poet who developed the sonnet as a literary form. All in all, Chaucer's poems are full of Italian references, and his stay in Lombardy for sure must have had an impact on his literary work. Speaking of Petrarch and his sonnets, it is inevitable to mention one of the greatest sonnet writers in English, who also happened to be the greatest playwright of all time, William Shakespeare. It goes without saying that the influence of Italian culture on his dramas is enormous. There are even speculations that he could have visited Italy between 1580 and 1590, but there is literally no evidence confirming such a journey. However, when we analyze Shakespeare's plays set abroad, Italy clearly stands out in comparison with other countries, whereas Austria or Bohemia, today's Czechia, are rather imaginary lands than real political and geographic entities. Italian cities such as Verona, Romeo and Juliet, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Venice, Othello, The Merchant of Venice, Messina, Much Ado About Nothing, prove the author's good knowledge of not only their geographical situation, but also details referring to their internal structures. It is also worth mentioning Julius Caesar, obviously set in ancient Rome, or The Tempest, where the main character, Prospero, is the Duke of Milan, and his enemy is King of Naples. It is a popular knowledge that certain conspiracy theories deny the very existence of Shakespeare. There are also those who believe that, although the head of the London troupe of actors was a real person, he was not educated enough to write all his plays full of erudition. Thus, his dramas are attributed to his rich and mighty friends, Earl of Southampton, Earl of Oxford, or scholar and philosopher Francis Bacon. Because Shakespeare is not main subject of this presentation and does not matter whether he was in Italy or not, or whether he wrote all his plays or the plays attributed to him or not. What matters is that Elizabethan and Jacobean England, at least aristocrats, were familiar with Italy because they traveled there. Even though there were also a number of Italian merchants, artisans, and artists in London from whom Shakespeare could have drawn on his ideas, the English certainly traveled to Italy. Thus, in the early 17th century, we can assume that trips of English gentlemen to Italian state cities was a fact. Nevertheless, the 30 Years' War in Europe and the English Civil War were not conducive to travel. Therefore, we can say that the greater popularity of those trips started after the restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660. They took a form of organized tours of the oldest sons of English upper-class families. Only the oldest sons inherited the aristocratic title and their father's properties. They were supervised by the so-called governors or tutors. Young men used to spend up to 4 years traveling around the continent, mainly in France and Italy. It was supposed to be part of their formative process, a kind of education. It wasn't, however, until 1670 that such a quasi-educational expeditions received their name. It was the year of publication of the travel journal of Richard Lascelles entitled The Voyage to Italy, or A Complete Journey Through Italy in 2 parts. Lascelles was a Roman Catholic priest, but also a tutor or governor to a number of English noblemen, with whom he traveled to Italy 5 times. It was he who coined and first used the term Grand Tour. It is worth mentioning that consequently another term was coined, the term that we still use in reference to ourselves. Someone who went on the Grand Tour was a tourist. Tourists met interesting people, even though for them the greatest pleasure was the company of other English tourists. They could go sightseeing in Florence, famous for Leonardo and Michelangelo, in Rome, where lavish and opulent ecclesiastical and secular architecture could take one's breath away, or in Venice. Interestingly, one of popular destinations was relatively small Vicenza, where the Englishman could admire buildings designed by Andrea Palladio. Palladio was an architect who, besides designing churches, palaces, and villas in Vicenza, Venice, and smaller places nearby, wrote Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, the 4 books on architecture, a source of inspiration for English architects such as Inigo Jones or Christopher Wren. Jones, one of the earliest tourists, visited Vicenza to see for himself the masterpieces of Palladio. Consequently, they developed in Britain the variation of Baroque style called Palladianism. Queen's House at Greenwich, designed by Inigo Jones, Chiswick House and Burlington House by Richard Boyle, another English architect, are but a few examples of the Palladian architecture in Britain. Among famous grand tourists was Edward Gibbon, historian and author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The book still reprinted and read. As he wrote in his journal, his direct inspiration to write, it was chanting of Franciscan monks he heard one night in Rome. It is important to remember that many tourists kept travel journals, which provide a fascinating source of information about the life of English upper classes in the 17th and 18th centuries. One of such diaries was that written by James Boswell, the author of the biography of Dr. Samuel Johnson. English noblemen learned to be courteous, how to ride a horse, and how to fence. These skills had little to do with academic or artistic knowledge. However, they seemed an indispensable element of aristocratic education. Horse riding and fencing were elements of the art of war. As we know, Italian city-states during the Renaissance period conducted incessant wars and elevated those martial arts to a very high level. Not every young Englishman was diligent and eager to acquire valuable knowledge Italy offered them. Many preferred spending time partying, that is, dancing, drinking, and having love affairs with either noble ladies or courtesans. Venetian brothels were very popular among British aristocrats. Consequently, the conduct of the tourists, as well as the idea of the Grand Tour itself, became an object of criticism. Philosopher John Locke, for example, claimed that young noblemen learn nothing useful from their journeys. Fencing, more appropriate in duels, had little application in the wars of the 18th century. The necessity of traveling with a governor or tutor clearly showed that the tourists are not mature enough to travel as independent adults. Wasting their energy at parties, they are unable to live the tough life of an English country gentleman. In England, there emerged a stereotype of a tourist as an effeminate fop rather than a reasonable, down-to-earth person. The educational value of tours to Europe was also undermined. In the 18th century, the global situation was completely different than that in the times of Chaucer or even in the times of Inigo Jones, just a century before. Whereas at the advent of Baroque, England was still a peripheral monarchy, while Italian cities were the center of European civilization. In the second half of the 18th century, Britain was a modern empire. And it was Britain from which one could learn how to be a leader of civilization. Italy lost its appeal as the vanguard of progress in politics or architecture. Well, it was still attractive as a land of the ancient Roman Empire and the Renaissance, which means that the only value attributed to Italy was the matter of history rather than the present time. English aristocrats still traveled to Italy, but looked down on the Italians, who had little to offer. The French Revolution in 1789 put an end to the Grand Tour proper. It was obvious that it was not safe to travel through France gripped by anti-aristocratic rage. However, did the English stop visiting Italy? Sightseeing Rome, one may come across the non-Catholic cemetery, Cimitero Acattolico, or Protestant cemetery, also known as English cemetery, Cimitero degli Inglesi, where John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley are buried. Those great romantic poets spent years in Italy and died in Rome. Among the famous literary figures who lived in Italy was George Byron, who was a supporter of the Carbonari secret revolutionary organizations seeking to overthrow old monarchies and unite Italy. Byron's emotional connection with Italy may be found in the stanzas of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, or in the Ode to Venice, where he mourns the once powerful republic now destroyed by Napoleon. In the 26th stanza of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Byron writes, "The commonwealth of kings, the men of Rome, and even since and now fair Italy, thou art the garden of the world, the home of all art yields and nature can decree. Even in thy desert, what is like to thee? Thy very weeds are beautiful, thy waste more rich than other climes' fertility. Thy wreck a glory, and thy ruin graced with an immaculate charm which cannot be defaced." Italy didn't lose its attractive power over Englishmen even in the Victorian era, nor even in the 20th century. When William Dorrit, one of the protagonists of Charles Dickens' novel Little Dorrit, is released from a debtor's prison due to the fact that a rich aunt left him her fortune, one of the first decisions he makes is, as a rich man, is to take his whole family on a tour to Italy. 2 chapters of the book are set in Venice. Traveling is something befitting a gentleman of leisure, and traveling to Italy is something that upper classes always do. Evelyn Waugh, who traveled to Italy himself, sends the main character of his novel Brideshead Revisited, Oxford student Charles Ryder, first on Easter vacation to Ravenna, and then with his friend Sebastian Flight to Venice, where the latter's father resides permanently. When they decide to go sightseeing, they say, "We will become tourists." The 20th century trips were not as common and as long as those in the era of the Grand Tour, but demonstrate that for an educated Englishman, it was still in good taste to visit Italy. What do we owe the Grand Tour today? In 1748, after the discovery of Pompeii, destroyed by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, this gave rise to enormous interest in antiquities among English tourists. They began collecting everything that was excavated. They also financed excavations, which was the beginning of archaeology. What they purchased in Italy, they brought to England to create sometimes really impressive collections. If someone has an interesting collection, they usually want to show it to others. Here we have the beginning of modern museums. English aristocrats also bought paintings and sculptures. Of course, many of them, especially those who were not experts, fell prey of crooks and forgers. However, real connoisseurs sponsored great art. For example, in 1731, Lord John Russell commissioned 24 views of Venice from Canaletto, Giovanni Antonio Canal, not his nephew Bernardo Bellotta, as we may think in Poland. To sum up, we inherited from the Grand Tour period archaeology, museums and art galleries, architectural influences, travelogues, and above all, the desire to explore different places and learn foreign cultures, which we all refer to as tourism.